On to the modernist art of North America during the first half of the 20th century. And hooray, your last lecture of the unit. By the early 20th century, America was joining the art world, although it would achieve much greater importance after World War II, when New York City replaced Paris as the epicenter of modern art. This rather gritty painting of tenement dwellers in New York City, and I do love the title, is an example of the Ashcan School. These were realist painters who wanted Americans to confront poverty and then do something about it. This is not a required image, but it's an important and interesting American art movement. Another important early 20th century movement in literature, art, and most of all in music is the Harlem Renaissance, led by African Americans such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Zora Neale Hurston. Aaron Douglas was a Harlem Renaissance artist who did not make the required works list, but I love his work, so I'm sticking in these illustrations from a gospel hymn book. And now we come to the most famous work, or rather series of works, by a Harlem Renaissance artist, although the migration of the Negro was actually created during the early years of World War II. During and after World War I, millions of African Americans migrated north to find better jobs and escape legally enforced Jim Crow laws, formal segregation. Jacob Lawrence chronicled their experiences in a powerful series of paintings. Among these migrants, by the way, were Jacob Lawrence's parents. Conversations with his parents and other migrants was a major source for these works. Here are two more panels from the series. The one on the left is our required work. These paintings are very recognizable, and the College Board might well ask you to do just that with an attribution question. What's not included here are the very long caption titles that Lawrence gave these works. So, here is the full title of number 49, which is our required work. I don't think you have to memorize all this. Migration of the Negro should be enough. Maybe you should try to remember panel number 49. Most Southern blacks migrated to the North filled with optimism about a better future. However, many were disappointed to find that the North had its own vicious brand of discrimination. Black migrants were segregated into the most dilapidated sections of northern cities, forced to pay high prices for inferior housing, and discriminated against in the workplace. This panel shows a public dining space in the North. Blacks and whites are divided by a yellow barrier that zigzags through the center of the painting. The yellow dividing line is further emphasized by the tilted tabletops and chairs situated against the background of the restaurant floor. Tables and chairs are likewise placed to reinforce the diner segregation. Note that only the white figures have faces. So here's a formal analysis of Lawrence's series from the Phillips Gallery in Washington, D.C., which houses half of the series. I quote, "Lawrence's paintings show only essential imagery, flattened, angular forms, strong diagonals, and contrasts of light and shadow all contribute to the dynamism of the images. Although Lawrence used a limited color palette, he arranged the colors to form focal points to direct the viewer's attention. As the narrative unfolds from image to image, the vantage point, composition, and details change in a manner reminiscent of a film. In some panels, human figures dominate. In others, the setting propels the story. The people are not individualized, rather they represent collective characteristics. The materials he chose are interesting as well. Lawrence had begun working with Cassine Tempera as a young art student at a community center in Harlem. It was inexpensive and it was easily obtained. Ditto for hardboard, less expensive and easier to use and prepare than canvas. Cassine tempera, unlike the egg yolk tempera used by medieval and early Renaissance painters, is based on milk proteins, but like egg tempera, it dries very quickly, produces vivid colors, and once dry is very durable. So I was disappointed that Georgia O'Keeffe didn't make the cut. She's famous for her paintings of the Southwest, where she lived part of the year, and even more famous for her detailed, evocative close-ups of flowers, which some viewers and critics insisted were actually thinly disguised sexual imagery. The artist denied this, by the way, but lots of critics remain unconvinced. Georgia O'Keeffe was discovered by, and later married to, the most prominent American photographer of the early 20th century, Alfred Stiglitz. This is probably his most famous photograph, and it's one of our required works. The Khan Academy essay gives you some fascinating background on how and why this work was created, which I won't repeat, except to note again that the passengers were not arriving in America, but rather returning to Europe. some voluntarily to return home or visit family, some involuntarily because they had been denied admission at Ellis Island. Stiglitz began his career as a practitioner of pictorial or painterly photography, that is, photographs that deliberately mimic the techniques and results of painters, especially Impressionists. The photo on the upper left is surely channeling Monet. But in the early 20th century, he moved away from the pictorial approach to what the Metropolitan Museum of Art website describes as an effort to, quote, promote an unvarnished display of the medium's, that is, photography's, natural strength, namely its capacity for producing a truthful rendering of abstract form and tonal variation in the real world. In other words, the evolution of his photographic style in some ways mirrored the movement from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism, even to Cubism. The Steerage captures Stiglitz's approach to photography. Here's what the Met has to say about this work. The Steerage began its life as a masterpiece 4 years after its creation, when Stiglitz published it in a 1911 issue of his journal, Camera Work, and, I think this is interesting, paired it with a Cubist drawing by Picasso. Stiglitz loved to talk about how Picasso had praised the collage-like dispersal of forms and shifting depths of the Steerage. At this point in his career, Stiglitz had embraced what he described as, quote, straight, unmanipulated, unquote, photographs that caught some important aspects of real life. But he was a modernist, and one reason he and subsequent critics love this photograph is how it captures a variety of geometric shapes. So, he was still seeking to promote photography as fine art, not as a mere journalistic tool. Here's another famous example of Stiglitz's later work. I love the way this photo captures the dust thrown up by the wind, by the wind and the horse's hooves. And here's one of his relatively few PG-rated photos of his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe. This work didn't make the list, but it's famous and beautiful, so during the Depression, the government sponsored art as part of its relief program. One of these artists was photographer Dorothea Lange, whose photographs of rural depression would transfix Americans and help create new support for government welfare programs. The 1930s also saw the rise of Mexican mural paintings, many of which had strong political content motivated by the Mexican Revolution that overthrew military rule early in the 20th century. The most famous of the Mexican mural painters was Diego Rivera. This is a reconstructed version of a mural that Rockefellers hired Rivera to paint for the lobby of Rockefeller Plaza. When Rivera chose to include the Soviet leader Lenin in his mural about progress, the Rockefeller family fired him and had the mural destroyed. I've drawn an arrow to the portrait of Lenin and blown up the image. Rivera persuaded the Mexican government to let him repaint the mural from photographs on a blank wall at the Palacio de Bellas in Mexico City. This sweeping portrait of Mexican history and Diego Rivera's present is our required work. In this 50-foot fresco mural, hundreds of characters from 400 years of Mexican history gather for a stroll through Alameda Park, Mexico City's first city park, built, by the way, on the grounds of an ancient Aztec marketplace. Rivera, and I've circled him in red, portrays himself as a child standing against a backdrop of Mexican history. Next to him is his wife, Frida Kahlo, holding a yin and yang symbol representing masculine and feminine duality. But the most striking figure by far is La Catrina. Catrina was a nickname in the early 20th century for an elegant upper-class Mexican woman who dressed in European clothing. But printmaker Jose Posada, shown here tipping his hat, had made a famous print depicting her as a skeleton, a shout-out to what he and Rivera both saw as the corruption of Mexico's elite. Moving from left to right, the work begins with the Spanish conquest of Mexico and the colonial period, circled in green. To the right is the 19th century wars of intervention, foreign intervention that is, a reform movement led by Benito Juarez, and the imposition of a French emperor, Maximilian. This complicated period is circled in red. Next came the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, circled in blue, followed by the Revolution of 1910, circled in purple. On the far right, circled in orange, we see post-revolutionary Mexico, that is, what was modern Mexico in Rivera's time. Here are some, sorry, that's why I was building so slowly. There. Here are some close-ups of conquest and international intervention and reform periods. And here we see a policeman brutally attacking a peasant during Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship, a time when Mexico modernized, but mostly for the benefit of the small upper class. Here are scenes from the Revolution, which included major peasant revolts led by revolutionaries who were both political visionaries and bandits. Note that the revolutionaries get a much more sympathetic portrayal from Rivera. So I borrowed a series of complicated PowerPoints from another teacher, and I've copied several of these into your workbooks. Note that Rivera included 3 Mexican presidents, identified here by red triangles. Okay, now I'm going to let this build. Sorry, I was caught by surprise there. And here are some other notable figures, including our old friend Sor Juana. The figures in the foreground come from the immediate past and present and represent the different social strata of turn-of-the-century Mexico, that is, of Rivera's childhood. On the left, we see a fashionable woman in red silk and lace, the kind of customer who bought Rivera's works. Near her, in the yellow dress, is Lavrelotza, a well-known singer and prostitute. She is defiantly staring down a policeman. And near her, on crutches, is another real-life character from Diego's childhood in the Alameda, a hero of the wars of intervention. Again, the right-hand section of the mural depicts the peasant and popular movements that culminated in the Revolution of 1910. It includes the revolutionary triumvirate of soldier, worker, and peasant, who together led that revolution. At the far right, we see post-revolutionary Mexico, dominated by skyscrapers. Rivera portrays the corruption and collusion of bourgeoisie, politicians, and priests with another triumvirate: president, archbishop, and businessman. The archbishop is hard to make out. I've circled him in red. When the fresco was completed in 1948, a fight broke out over one detail: a small historical text dating from the 19th century bearing the words "God does not exist." The fresco was destined for the dining room of the new Hotel del Prado, but the Archbishop of Mexico refused to bless the building until the blasphemy was removed. A protester damaged the painting, and it was concealed behind a wall for the next 9 years. Ultimately, Rivera agreed to change the offending inscription, and the hotel displayed the mural once again. Later, to satisfy public interest in the work, the mural was transported, wall and all, into the reception hall. On the right, you see the document that used to read, "God does not exist." Mid-century, Jose Rivera was much more famous than his wife, Frida Kahlo, and that's not true today. Here is a painting of Frida and her famous husband, Diego Rivera. Note how small she's made herself. Admittedly, he was a big guy. Still, I think this painting says something disturbing about their relationship, which was often stormy and at one point ended in a divorce that proved only temporary. Drum rolls, our last work of this unit. Mexican painter Frida Kahlo is usually classified as a surrealist, but her work also includes political commentary. Here we see the artist torn between her 2 heritages, her Mexican mother and her German father. The heart could express a broken heart, the ties of mixed blood, or even could reference Mexico's Aztec heritage. As we'll see in a minute or so, Frida Kahlo rejected the label of surrealist painter, yet note how many symbols she has inserted into this work. A bird, for example, often symbolizes freedom in life, especially a hummingbird, which is colorful and also always hovering over flowers. But in this painting, the hummingbird is black and lifeless, and this might be a symbol of Frida herself. She spent most of her life in physical pain after a bus accident that occurred when she was 18. Thorns, of course, have a biblical association with martyrdom, and black cats are a traditional symbol of bad luck. Here are 2 more highly biographical paintings and explanations from art history websites. For Wounded Deer, on the left, in 1946, Frida Kahlo had an operation on her spine in New York. She was hoping this surgery would free her from the severe back pain, but it failed. This painting expressed her disappointment toward the operation. After she went back to Mexico, she suffered both physical pain and emotional depression. Frida, by the way, used her pet deer Granzio as the model when she painted this portrait. She had many pets which she used as her surrogate children, and deer is her favorite kind. This painting has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some art historians think it primarily expressed her frustration over the botched surgery. Others said it portrays her inability to control her own destiny. And still other art historians believe that the painting has sexual overtones and expressed her struggle in different relationships. Tree of Hope from the same year also captures Frida Kahlo's frustration over the failed operation. We see a second Frida on a hospital gurney. So, here's an old AP question about Frida Kahlo's work, back from when there was always a quote-based question on the exam. I'm hoping that you have time to discuss how you would answer. You've now learned about surrealism, and you've seen several works by Frida Kahlo. What do you think? Is she a surrealist? We'll close with a test review for the unit test, and then on to our final